Let me get everybody to stand up. Welcome all the pictures.
Tell the guy at the desk here, because he's going to do what.
Welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome your MC for today, Mr. Peter Indoro. Nice round of applause.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please can we be upstanding for our guests as they come into the room? Thank you all very, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, in fact, can I just ask you to, is our choir here? Are we here? Oh, there we go. All right. Just before we start officially, a couple of things. First of all, Sanibonani. Thank you so much. Ngingu Peter Ndoro. I'll be your program director. I used to call myself a master of ceremonies, but in Zambia, a master of ceremonies helps with circumcisions. So, so I'll be your program director for the rest of today. First thing, please just check your mobile phones. In fact, please take your seats for a couple of seconds. Please check your mobile phones. Just make sure that they're off or that they're on silent. I know that some of you are on social media and love to Insta and TikTok and what, Bookface. So our hashtag is hashtag Luthuli Museum, hashtag Cal ML17. That's Chief Albert Luthuli Memorial Lecture 17, hashtag CALML17. Also a little bit later on, in fact, you'll find on your chairs already cards that you can use to write your questions that you can pose to our panelist and our guest speaker. All of that I'll explain again and remind you a little bit later on. But first, let's begin the program. Very importantly, if I could ask you all, ladies and gentlemen, to stand for the anthems of our continent and our country. We start with the African Union anthem.
So we can celebrate together. The victories of one generation. Let's dedicate ourselves to rise together.
To defend our liberty and unity.
Let's dedicate ourselves to fight together for peace and justice on earth. Oh, so we go to Africa. The break of mankind and fought of righteous. The break of dawn. Oh, the sun and dawn.
Ladies and gentlemen, before I ask you to sit down, if I could just ask you to stay standing for just a little bit longer. We'd like to observe a moment of silence for one of our fallen comrades, the former chairperson of the Luthuli Museum Council, who had a long and distinguished career, not just fighting for our country's liberation and democracy, in government as a former KwaZulu Natal member of a provincial legislature, but also very much in the work of the Luthuli Museum Council as chairperson, and he contributed immensely. And I think he was a voice that we all came to love, recognize, and cherish. One of the things that he did was champion the creating of the Chief Albert Luthuli Research Chair in partnership with UNISA, and many recognize Mr. Important Mkhize as a man who led with the spirit of Luthuli. So please let's observe a moment of silence as we remember a fallen comrade. Thank you very much indeed. Please be seated. Professor Thandabantu Nhlapo, who's our esteemed speaker for the 17th Annual Chief Albert Luthuli Memorial Lecture. Professor Mkhize, Deputy Vice Chancellor and Head of College of Humanities at the University of KwaZulu Natal. Mr. Erwin Langeveld, Acting Deputy Director General at the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture. Advocate Vusi Kuzwayo, Senior Counsel. Professor Tenjiwe Meiwa, Vice Principal Research, Postgraduate Studies, Innovation and Commercialization at the University of South Africa. Professor Puleng Segalo, Chief Albert Luthuli Research Chair. Mr. Sandile Luthuli and the Luthuli family members, members of the Luthuli Museum Council, members of the Executive Management, University of KwaZulu Natal, Luthuli Museum Management, academics and professional staff, members of the SRC and fellow students, distinguished alumni, members of the diplomatic corps here present, leaders in business and the legal fraternity, very importantly, members of the Groutville community, a chorus of rustics, a group of young writers and poets from the Groutville community as well, members of the media, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and everybody who just came for the tea. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us for this, the 17th Chief Albert Luthuli Memorial Lecture. And for those of you that are watching at home, streaming live and couldn't be here at this venue, thank you so much indeed for joining us as well and being part of this wonderful lecture series where we find a way to reflect on the work and the life and the legacy of Chief Albert Luthuli. Now, every year, this memorial lecture works to promote the principles and values of Chief Albert Luthuli, namely peace, human rights, justice, and the coexistence of people, irrespective of race, color, or creed. This lecture over the years has been delivered by a number of luminaries, both from here and abroad, and many of them huge names, because I think it has been important to reflect the importance of Dr. Luthuli Chief Albert Luthuli, not just here, but globally as well. And we'll find out a little bit more about that global part that he played, particularly when it comes to Glasgow University in Scotland. So today we're honored to have a remarkable man who's distinguished himself as an academic. He's also served the country in legal research and also in the diplomatic corps. Professor Nhlapo will be delivering the 17th Chief Albert Luthuli Memorial Lecture, exploring the theme, Customary Law in the South African Legal System, the role of the courts, legislature, and civil society. And so it'll be very interesting to see how that has played out. Some of it may sound academic, but this is a struggle that we have across the continent, actually, where the laws of the day, do they embrace those customs and traditions that we've passed down through our communities over time? And this is something that Chief Albert Luthuli himself considered and had to deal with. One of the issues was his own chieftainship. And he once said in 1962, although 4 out of Grantville's 7 chiefs have been Luthulis, my family has never laid claim to hereditary rights. The people of Grantville have found democratic methods effective and satisfactory that have used these practices not only to elect chiefs, but on 2 occasions to replace them without their rule was felt to be not in the community's interest. So this is something that he himself considered, and we look forward to hearing from Professor Nhlapo what this means in the modern day. So for those of you who are here for the first time and perhaps have come into contact with the Memorial Lecture for the first time, these lectures have been a rich partnership over years between the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, the Luthuli Foundation, Luthuli Museum, as well as the University of KwaZulu Natal. And we have a simple program. I'm going to ask members of that partnership to join us on stage to share a few thoughts. Then we'll hear the lecture and we'll give you an opportunity to pose some questions to our guests that'll be on the stage. And then after that, we'll hand over a portrait that's been painted by an amazing young artist, and I'll introduce him to you a little bit later on. And this is really as a tribute to both Chief Albert Luthuli, but also to our guest speaker delivering the memorial lecture. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's begin with our program as we hear from one of these key partners in making sure that these lectures are able to continue. It's my great pleasure to welcome the Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Head of the College of Humanities at the University of KwaZulu Natal, Professor Nhlanhla Mkhize.
Program Director, Mr. Peter Ndoro, guest speaker, Professor Thandabantu Nhlapo, our esteemed speaker for the 17th Annual Inkosi Albert Luthuli Memorial Lecture, together with your family, Advocate Vusi Kuzwayo, Senior Counsel, Acting Deputy Director General, Department of Sport, Arts and Culture, Mr. Ivan Langefeld, Chairperson of the Luthuli Museum, Professor Mchunu, Chairperson of the Luthuli Foundation, Mr. Mthunzi Luthuli, Mr. Sandile Luthuli and the Luthuli family, CTR Bomodlanduna, Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Tenjiwe Meiwa from the University of South Africa, Chief Albert Luthuli Research Chair, Professor Puleng Sekgalo, members of the Luthuli Museum Council, members of Council of the University of KwaZulu Natal, members of the Executive Management of the University of KwaZulu Natal, academics and professional staff, Luthuli Museum Management, members of the Student Representative Council, fellow students and distinguished guests, members of the Diplomatic Corps, leaders in business and the legal fraternity, members of the Crowdville community, members of the media, distinguished guests, and all protocol observed. I am honored to welcome all of you present at this distinguished lecture. This welcome is also extended to those joining us via Zoom and those watching via different streaming platforms such as YouTube. Inkosi Albert Luthuli Memorial Lecture is one of our calendar's most anticipated events. So we are delighted that the day has finally come. However, this year's lecture holds immense emotional significance as it is being held 3 months to the day since the loss of Ubaba Important Mkhize. At the time of his passing on the 10th of September this year, Kabazela held the position of chairperson of the Luthuli Museum, amongst many of the notable roles he held in service of our nation. Kabazela's tenure as chairperson of the Luthuli Museum was characterized by his unwavering dedication to safeguarding and promoting Inkosi Albert Luthuli's legacy and ideals. He was a revered figure whose absence is profoundly felt. And as we honor his memory, we accept the solemn responsibility to continue the critical work he championed. We are confident that Professor Mchunu Macingwane is up to the task and will continue where Kabazela left off. Sithi Kabazela, Kamavovo, Kasibiside, Simajembelezana, Mumbo Ombulazi, owadla umuntu bemnyenga ngendaba, ulale ngokuthula. Ladies and gentlemen, for 17 consecutive years, we have assembled and listened to various speakers deliver this lecture. The occasion has served to celebrate the life and contributions Inkosi Albert Luthuli, Africa's first Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and a colossus of our liberation struggle. Yet, over these years, it has become clear that this lecture is not merely a retrospective celebration. This occasion is but an urgent call to action to further Inkosi Luthuli's ideals and tirelessly work towards crafting a more just society. It has and continues to serve that purpose. Inkosi Luthuli envisioned a world where respect for human rights, peace, equality, democracy, justice, and non-violence aren't merely lofty ideals, but the foundational pillars upon which all our communities are built. Even as we face global and local challenges that threaten these principles, these ideals remain the unwavering guide in our collective quest for a just and peaceful world. The life and teachings of Inkosi Luthuli also offer us invaluable insights and should be used as a guide as we embark on our efforts to drive change. We believe that each step we take, no matter the scale, must also be a step towards realizing the noble dreams to which Inkosi Luthuli and his contemporaries dedicated their lives. Your attendance today is one such step. It is more than a tribute to Inkosi Luthuli's memory. It is an active affirmation of our shared dedication to the principles he held dear. Together, we remember a great leader and reinforce our united resolve to embody the values of human dignity, equality, and peace that he so ardently championed. As the University of KwaZulu Natal, we shall continue playing our part in supporting this lecture, which is in line with our commitment to knowledge creation and our strategic direction to confront the myriad social challenges we encounter. We thank the Luthuli Foundation, the Luthuli Museum, and the National Department of Arts and Culture for extending the invitation to Professor Nhlapo. Professor Nhlapo's formidable expertise in customary law makes him the perfect guest speaker for today's topic. We are privileged to welcome Professor Nhlapo to our university and eagerly anticipate an enlightening discourse that promises to inspire and provoke thought. Once again, on behalf of the University of KwaZulu Natal, we thank you for your presence and for joining us in this significant commemoration. I thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, on your behalf, I'd like to say thank you very much indeed to the Deputy Vice Chancellor. Professor Mkhize, thank you for the commitment that the University of KwaZulu Natal has shown in making sure that these lecture series continue over the decades. So thank you so much indeed for your opening remarks and thoughts there. Now, a little bit earlier on, I told you that Chief Albert Luthuli was not just an icon here in South Africa, but he really grew in global stature, particularly after he won the Nobel Peace Prize. People were speaking his name. People like Martin Luther King, who admired Chief Albert Luthuli's adherence to nonviolence. And he was a friend to Martin Luther King. And he said he admired Chief Albert Luthuli's dedication to the cause of freedom and dignity. But he's also recognized in Scotland. And you're going to see by who and why. But just for us to know that his renown was global in nature, let's listen to the recognition that he received in Glasgow in Scotland. All right, as they find this video, I think there's only 2 ever South Africans who were honored in this way. Here we go.
In years gone by, some of the great men of our century have stood here, right here, to receive this award. Men whose names and deeds have enriched the pages of human history. No one could be left unmoved at being plucked from the village of Groundville, a small village, which does not even feature on many maps, to be plucked from banishment in a rural backwater, to be lifted out of the narrow confines of South Africa's internal politics and placed here in the shadow of these great figures I've referred to is indeed an honor. The Nobel Peace Award that has brought me here, it is the welcome recognition of the role played by the African people during the last 50 years to establish peacefully a society in which merit and not race would fix the position of the individual in the life of the nation.
Right now.
So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Whilst he was a beacon of light, a hope and inspiration for millions of South Africans, he was a global icon in many, many ways. And the world paid tribute to him. And so we can be rightly proud of this international statesman who served his people and in a distinguished way. Ladies and gentlemen, following that video, we continue getting some thoughts from the partners that bring these lecture series together. And the Department of Sports and Arts and Culture has been a long-standing friend and partner, and their commitment and contributions have really been immense over the years. And so to say a few words on behalf of the department, it's my great pleasure to welcome the Acting Deputy Director General, Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, Mr. Erwin Langeveld.
Thank you, Program Director Sanbonani. I will henceforth use the title Master of Ceremonies with great caution. Program Director, Prof. Nkolisi Mkunu, Chairperson of the Luthuli Museum Council, Council of the Chief Albert Luthuli Museum, members present here, Mr. Sandile Luthuli, other members of the Luthuli family present, Professor Nhlanhla Mkhize, Deputy Vice Chancellor and Head College of Humanities, University of KwaZulu Natal, and other members of council present here today, the management of both the University of KwaZulu Natal and the Chief Albert Luthuli Museum, our honored guest, Professor Thandabantu Nhlapo, our guest to deliver the memorial lecture today, Advocate Vusi Kuzwayo, SC, our discussant, honored guests, students, ladies and gentlemen. We must also acknowledge the Groundville community, as is indicated by our program director, the diplomatic corps, as well as the media present here today. It's always a great pleasure for the Ministry and the Department of Sport, Arts and Culture to be invited to participate in this occasion that honors one of the greatest leaders to have come from the African continent, Chief Albert Luthuli. Ladies and gentlemen, peoples and nations consciously and actively remember past events, epochs, and people that have shaped their development. We do this through commemorative events. We also build memorials, monuments, and museums. We undertake such as theatrical and musical performances, films, and documentaries, as well as memorial lectures and other acts of remembering. The then Department of Arts and Culture has, through the legacy projects that were introduced in 1998, was approved by Cabinet in that year, paid homage to a wide range of heroes, heroines, and events that contributed to the resistance against colonialism and to the struggle for liberation. Since the inception of this program, we have seen the development of many heritage facilities. Examples are the Nelson Mandela Museum, the Samora Machel Memorial and Interpretive Center, the Matola Museum in Mozambique, the Steve Biko Memorial and Interpretive Center, Freedom Park, the declaration of the graves of many of our heroines, Lillian Ngoyi, Helen Joseph, Charlotte Maxeke, Rahima Musa, and many more of our stalwarts. Many of these activities have contributed quite substantially to transforming the heritage landscape. More recently, this work is being continued within the context of the Resistance and Liberation Heritage Route, which is the South African chapter of the Continental Roads to Independence African Liberation Program, which the African Union tasked Tanzania to lead in 2011, after UNESCO declared liberation heritage as heritage of outstanding universal value in 2005. We continue to do this work to ensure that the current and future generations recognize and appreciate that freedom was not free, and to draw inspiration from how it was achieved in order to do what is necessary to safeguard it going forward. In the case of Chief Albert Luthuli, the annual memorial lecture, it is one amongst many components of the Luthuli Legacy Project. When the project was launched in 2004, it entailed the refurbishment and transformation of the Luthuli home into the House Museum, the construction of the Interpretive Center, the upgrading and restoration of the Congregational Church of Southern Africa, in which Chief Albert Luthuli was the deacon, and in which he laid in state at his death. The production of the documentary on the life and times of Chief Albert Luthuli, and of course, the inaugural memorial lecture, whose centerpiece at the time was the posthumous award of an honorary doctorate in law to this political icon. This memorial lecture continues to serve as a platform to produce knowledge about Chief Albert Luthuli and who he was and what he stood for. It continues to serve as a platform for dialogue and public engagement on difficult matters important to South Africa, the African continent, and the globe, considered through the demanding markers of Chief Luthuli's legacy. As intended, the memorial lecture continued to serve as a platform for collaboration. Indeed, the partnerships formed since the inaugural lecture in 2004 have solidified and have become institutionalized. And we commend the partners for sustaining this invaluable asset in this manner. The ministerially appointed Indigenous Knowledge Systems panel of experts appointed by the Minister of Sport, Arts and Culture a few years ago is monitoring the implementation of a 6-pillar strategy and implementation plan comprising, firstly, conducting a national audit of our intangible cultural heritage and our indigenous knowledge systems. Secondly, a national inventory of our intangible cultural heritage and our indigenous knowledge systems. Increasing economic beneficiation, especially for practitioners of our indigenous knowledge. Education, research and development. Raising awareness and promotion and community involvement, stakeholder engagement and partnerships. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to participate in the 17th edition of this prestigious event in our annual calendar, and are looking forward with keen anticipation to Prof. Nhlapo's lecture on the theme of customary indigenous law and the South African legal system, as well as subsequent discussions on this important topic. I thank you all and wish all of us an insightful 17th Chief Albert Luthuli Memorial Lecture. Thank you so much.
On your behalf, I'd like to thank Mr. Langeveld and the department actually for making sure that we can continue to enjoy these very, very important lectures. At this juncture, I'd just like us to welcome in our presence a representative from the royal household. Welcome. Thank you so much indeed for being with us. Right, now, one of the enduring traditions of the memorial lecture over the years has been the presentation of music or the arts in some performance in one way or the other. And the performers are carefully selected. And it's not just about music for music's sake or performance for performance sake, but also they represent something, some of the values that are important to an occasion such as this. And so today we have the singing sensations known, and you saw them earlier leading us in the singing of the national anthem. They call themselves I Grandi Tenori, which is sort of kind of local, come Italian. But what's wonderful about them, they were established in 2011, and they've been wowing audiences both here and abroad. And their vision really has been about being a home and hope to all underprivileged artists through staging locally and internationally composed music. Their mission is to inspire young people towards a drug-free society through creating means of exercising their hard-earned skills and talents. So again, it's not just music for music's sake, but music with a purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for I Grandi Tenori.
Manda. Manda. Nessun torma. Nessun torma. Principessa, nella tua fredda stanza, guardi la stelle d'amore che ti speranza.
Wow, weren't they fantastic? A big hand, ladies and gentlemen. I grandi tenori. Fantastic. What amazing talents that we have in this country. Great representatives for us. Thank you so much indeed for that rendition. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we really are now very close to that moment, the reason that we're here, and that's to hear this year's memorial lecture. And I'd just like to call upon now one final voice before that lecture to say a few words, remarks from the Luthuli Museum Council that's working very hard to make sure that the museum's vision and mission continues. Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, the chairperson who's going to also introduce our guest speaker today, the chairperson of the Luthuli Museum Council, Dr. Mxolisi Mchunu.
Our program director, Mr. Peter Ndoro, Professor Thandabantu Nhlapo, our esteemed speaker for 2023, Chief Albert Luthuli Annual Memorial Lecture, Advocate Vusi Kuzwayo SC, the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Nhlanhla Mkhize, Acting Deputy Director General, Mr. Erwin Langeveld, from the Department of Sports, Art and Culture, my colleagues from the Council, members of the Luthuli Museum Council, Mamu Veli and Sandile Luthuli and other family members present here, our acting Vice Chancellor from the University of South Africa, Professor Uthenjiwe Meyiwa, Chief Albert Luthuli Research Chair, Professor Puleng Sekhalo, members of the executive management from the University of KwaZulu Natal, the Luthuli management led by the director, Mr. Kaba, and the staff. We greet academics and professional staff from the University of KwaZulu Natal, members of the SRC and students, distinguished alumni, diplomatic corps, leaders in business and legal fraternity, members of the Groundville community, members of the media, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Luthuli Museum and partner organizations for this lecture, I welcome you to the 2023 Chief Albert Luthuli Memorial Lecture. More importantly, I welcome our guest speaker, Professor Nhlapo, and his beautiful wife, Mathokoza Nhlapo, our discussant advocate, Vusi Kuzwayo SC. The 61st year, or rather 61 years ago, Chief Albert Luthuli's global footprint made it mark amongst young university student activists who saw it fit to recognize and campaign for him to become a rector at their university, the University of Glasgow in Scotland. Befittingly, the students at this university fundraised and established a scholarship fund named after Chief Albert Luthuli. An alumnus of that university, Professor Nhlapo, one of the recipients of the scholarship, is present with us here today to deliver a lecture on a pertinent subject to our growing democracy. As the Luthuli Museum Council, we always look forward to this time of the year of the Chief Albert Luthuli Lecture, not only because it provides an opportunity to reflect on the legacy of Chief Albert Luthuli, as well as where we come from as a country, but also to engage in a dialogue as we navigate the challenging path toward challenging an inclusive society envisaged by Chief Albert Luthuli and many more like him. Thanks to a mutually beneficial partnership between the Department of Sport, Arts and Culture, the University of KwaZulu Natal, the Luthuli family, and the Groundville community. This has ensured the immortalization of the memory of Chief Albert Luthuli. Through such public platforms, such as the lecture, we continue in the quest to affirm marginalized histories and thus deepening the appreciation of the freedom we enjoy today. So our keynote speaker today, Professor Thandabantu Nhlapo, is a former deputy vice chancellor at the University of Cape Town and retired with the title of Professor Emeritus. He holds various degrees and accolades from the universities of Oxford, Glasgow, Botswana, Lesotho, and Swaziland. From 2004 to 2007, he was the chair of the Commission on Traditional Leadership Disputes and Claims, which was known as the Nhlapo Commission. Before then, he was the Deputy Chief of Mission and Deputy Ambassador at the Embassy of South Africa in Washington, D.C. Nhlapo was a full-time commissioner on the South African Law Reform Commission from 1996 to year 2000. As chair of the Project Committee on Customary Law, he was instrumental in the development of significant legislation in family law, including the recognition of Customary Marriages Act, which was passed by Parliament in 1998. He was head of Department of Private Law at the University of Cape Town and participated in the constitution-making process as convener of the Technical Committee on Traditional Leadership, a committee of experts that advised the Constitutional Assembly on all matters relating to customary law and to traditional authorities. Their work contributed to Chapter 12 of the present Constitution. So with those few words, ladies and gentlemen, I introduce and invite Professor Thandabantu Nhlapo to the podium to deliver the 17th Chief Albert Luthuli Memorial Lecture. I thank you.
Deputy Vice Chancellor and Head of College, the College of Humanities at this university, Professor Nhlanhla Mkhize, Acting Deputy Director General of the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, Mr. Erwin Langeveld, Chairperson of the Luthuli Museum, Professor Mxolisi Mchunu, and members of the Luthuli Museum Council, Advocate Vusi Kuzwayo, our discussant, Senior Counsel, Mr. Sandile Luthuli and the Luthuli family members, Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Tenji Mayu at UNIS. I heard the Chair of Council saying Acting Vice Chancellor. Chief Albert Luthuli Research Chair, Professor Puleng Sekgalo, members of the executive management of UKZN, members of the Luthuli Museum, academics and professional staff at UKZN, members of the SRC and students of UKZN, distinguished alumni of UKZN, members of the diplomatic corps, if any are here, leaders in business and the legal fraternity, members of the Krautville community, members of the media, distinguished guests, and with your permission, Mr. Program Director, I cannot resist saying members of my own family as well. My wife, Matogoza, and various cousins and nephews and nieces from abroad. And by abroad, I mean Gqeberha, Gauteng, and Umlazi. If I may beg your indulgence, Chair, Program Director, I wish to make two requests. The first is that somebody bring me my bag from there where my spectacles are, so that I will stop stuttering and read properly. No, I'll keep it here. Thank you very much, Ms. Langefeld. Before I ask my second request of the program director, I do wish to express my deep and very sincere gratitude for the honor that has been bestowed upon me by the invitation from the Luthuli Museum Council to participate in this annual function, this solemn annual function, that is the Albert Luthuli Memorial Lecture. I feel truly honored and humbled. My second request, Mr. Program Director, is I wonder if, with your permission, I may pause here to make some introductory remarks and clarifications about today's event. As I do that, I am hoping that you, the audience, will see the reason for this request. First point I'd like to make, because of the need to publicize the event, we all agreed that the topic that should accompany the media advisories should be a short one, because the topic of this paper that I have submitted is quite long. But it is important to explain that the two things I'd like to put on record and to make sure that everybody understands is the fact that the topic of my presentation this afternoon is embedding customary law in the South African legal system in pursuit of Inkosi Albert Luthuli's vision of a free and diverse society, the role of citizens, the courts, and the legislature. The importance of reading that in full is because I'd like to make two distinctions as between the short version and the long version. The first is the idea of embedding customary law We are talking here about carving out a space for this legal system in our own legal universe, and not just carving out a space, but making sure that the space is then occupied by customary law permanently and strongly. The second distinction I'd like to make is the fact that for reasons of brevity, the short advisory topic that we agreed upon is about customary law, the role of the courts, the role of the legislature, and the role of civil society. I agree with that and I support it. I think the audience does require to know that in addition, my real interest is not just civil society in the way that we all understand it, which is when we as citizens and individuals are organized in pursuit of particular goals and objectives. I want to take it a step down from that to you and I and the men and women in the bus or the taxi, because those are people who are affected by customary law and who have views about customary law. This is not at all to diminish the role of civil society as organized groups. Indeed, in fact, as the lecture continues, you will find that their role has been, in fact, quite significant, especially in the field of litigation, which I shall get to. So, what is meant by all of this is that this is a lecture about the place of this legal system that we in fact know well because we're Africans, and it is embedded in us because that is how we grew up. But it's about its place in a modern democracy such as ours and in a legal system that is modern such as ours. In other words, it is not a lecture about the rules and principles of customary law. So when I look at the program, then discover that there is question and answer, I would beg you please not to ask how many cattle are paid for seduction by Bapedi when something goes wrong. That is rules of customary law. This is about system. It's a systemic kind of approach. Thirdly, Mr. Program Director, while I have your permission to diverge a bit, I will be trying to keep my promise to use my time, which is 40 minutes. And that means rather turning things upside down and putting all introductory material that I would have loved to put, and I would still like to, if we have a chance at the end, in particular, the wonderful memories that were evoked by the slides that the organizers kindly found from Glasgow, and my experiences of having been the first South African in the position of being an incumbent of the Chief Albert Luthuli Scholarship at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. Having said that, I would then suggest that the first point to make is that the experience of having been a holder of the Albert Luthuli Scholarship at the University of Glasgow means that I have a particularly strong association, which I hope and trust was in part the reason that I was invited to participate in this honor. Number two, I do acknowledge in the submitted document that I am indebted to previous speakers who have spoken very highly and quoted very many speeches of the great man himself, Inkosi Albert Luthuli. Even today, our speakers have expanded that understanding of the integrity and the worth of the work and the words of Inkosi Albert Luthuli. But because of the issue of having to compress this so that we can get to the core of the customary law issues, I will only add one or two further notions in my head that were brought in by listening to the words of Inkosi Albert Luthuli and hoping that with those words, I need go no further than to say, I do believe that he would have been a proponent of customary law because culture dignifies a people. The two that I would like to talk about are, for instance, an answer he gave in a speech in Johannesburg in 1958, when he was refuting a suggestion that South Africa was too diverse in terms of color, culture, race, and creed to be a successful democracy. And he said, I personally believe that here in South Africa, with all our diversities of color and race, we will show the world a new pattern of democracy. I think there is a challenge to us in South Africa to set a new example for the world. We can build a homogeneous South Africa on the basis not of color, but of human values. That is what Inkosi Albert Luthuli believed, a society based on human values. One that's quotation that has stuck with me for a long time is what he himself says in the epilogue of his autobiography, when he says, and I quote, "The task is not finished. South Africa is not yet a home for all of her sons and daughters. Such a home we wish to ensure. From the beginning of our history has been one, from the beginning, our history has been one of ascending unities, the breaking of tribal, racial, and creedal barriers. The past cannot hope to have a life sustained by itself. Racial ranged from the whole. There remains before us the building of a new land, a home for men who are black, white, brown, from the ruins of the old narrow groups, a synthesis of the rich cultural strains which we have inherited. There remains, he said, to be achieved our integration with the rest of our continent. Somewhere ahead, there beckons a civilization, a culture, which will take its place in the parade of God's history beside other great human synthesis, Chinese, Egyptian, Jewish, European. It will not necessarily be all black, but it will be African. For me, that says it all. The items that found themselves in our constitution as protecting historical identity would seem to be squarely in line with such thinking of Nkosi Albert Luthuli. The simple proposition in this essay is thus that the healthy infusion, of cultural diversity in this new South Africa, particularly as represented by the promotion and protection of customary law, would fit squarely within the vision of Nkosi Albert Luthuli that is outlined above. Several preliminary points need to be made in respect of the approach adopted in this paper in advancing this argument. Simply stated, it is argued that the recognition of a people's culture enhances their dignity, and that this is the primary reason for the inclusion of sections 30 and 31 of our constitution, that is the language of culture and the language and culture provisions, if you recall. And of course, section 211, subsection 3, which is the recognition of customary law itself in the constitution. I think with those preliminary words, I should jump in to the actual arguments, the points that I make in supporting those arguments. The first one is that I'd like to explain a little bit about what this thing is that is called customary law. I would like to then alert us to the fact that I have chosen in planning and developing the structure of this lecture around 3 role players or constituencies, if you like, as a test, or those that we are going to assess to test the main question raised in the paper, which is how well are we doing in embedding customary law in our legal landscape? And those 3 role players or constituencies are, firstly, us as individuals and citizens and just people. Secondly, the courts of law in our country. And thirdly, the legislature. But first, what is this customary law? Well, the easy answer, and it is maybe not easy, but straightforward, only gets complicated later. So let me start with it as a straightforward proposition. Customary law, sometimes called indigenous law, was recognized by section 211, subsection 3 of the South African Constitution in the following words: the courts must apply customary law when that law is applicable, subject to the Constitution and any legislation that specifically deals with customary law. I'd like to repeat that. The courts must apply customary law when that law is applicable, subject to the Constitution and any legislation that specifically deals with customary law. Now, this puts customary law on a par with common law and statute as independent sources of law in South Africa. This is an official endorsement that came after many decades of limited recognition, which relegated customary law to a subordinate system of law, one which applied solely to Black Africans, and moreover, only if it was not repugnant to natural justice or public policy. In other words, the infamous repugnancy clause. I would like to perhaps tease out some things from this language of recognition. The Recognition of Customary Marriages Act, which Professor Mtunu spoke of in talking about some of my career placements in the past, defines customary law as the customs and usages traditionally observed amongst the indigenous African peoples of South Africa, and which form part of the culture of those people, those peoples. So the link with culture is an important one. That is why the constitutional protections for culture, which are found in sections 30 and 31, make it clear that in addition to anything else, customary law is a cultural right. It is the right of citizens to have their lives guided, their disputes adjudicated by a law they find is part of their identity and that is not alien. Powerful amongst these rights of language and culture is in fact something that doesn't mention culture at all. It is section 15, subsection 3, which is in fact about freedom of opinion and religion. It reads thus, and it is headed, as I say, freedom of religion, belief, and opinion. It reads, firstly, this section does not prevent legislation recognizing marriages concluded under any tradition or system of religious, personal law, or family law. And secondly, it says it does not prevent legislation recognizing systems of personal or family law under any tradition or adhered to by persons professing a particular religion. This section, allowing for personal law in South Africa, personal family law, and marriages in particular, based on any tradition, brings the issue of tradition and culture squarely into the customary marriage. And a point has been made by Professor Bennett that of the various meanings associated with culture, the one most relevant to customary law is the one that relates culture to, I quote, a people's store of knowledge, beliefs, arts, morals, laws, and customs. In other words, everything that humans acquire by virtue of being members of society. He continues, culture in particular is an important issue, partly because it serves to identify the group to which a rule applies, and partly because it features as a constitutional right in terms of the sections we spoke about earlier. For me, this is a particularly helpful formulation because it underscores the link between customary law and the constitutional protection of culture, and in the context of living customary law, which is the next section that I will go into, it suggests a useful benchmark for assessing whether an alleged customary rule qualifies as law, by pointing out that the practice must have been seen to be in operation within an identified traditional community. And that opens up the way for us to enter into this very important business of living customary law. From very early on, the Constitutional Court made it very clear that in their interpretation, the language of recognition of Section 211, subsection 3, was language recognizing living customary law and not official customary law. I will not bother with listing the cases or discussing them in any depth. They include the certification case, which certified the new text of the new constitution by saying that as far as they are concerned, the customary law that 211.3 is talking about is an evolving customary law. Right there, you know that you are talking about something other than the customary law of the textbooks, and particularly the customary law of the great volume of jurisprudence that was produced by by apartheid courts, such as the native commissioners' courts. Living law is considered by the Constitutional Court to be an authentic set of norms governing the actual day-to-day relations of a community and adapted to changed social circumstances, where, to the contrary, official customary law is described as rigid, as dislocated from its social context as a result of state interference in the form of legislation, colonial misconceptions, distortion, and interpretation through Western-style courts. I don't know if any of you recall something that used to be the Native Administration Act, number 38 of 1927. It moved from Native Administration Act to Bantu Administration Act to Black Administration Act, as we ourselves moved in the eyes of white people in identifying us. That act had a section 11, subsection 3, subsection B. So 11.3b was careful to make the distinction that the whole of the act made in colonial times between, for instance, a marriage, which is what white people did, and a customary union, which what natives did, or at least so-called natives. Now, in that 11.3b, the language of that statute was that, having said who was married and who was not, any woman who consorts, any native woman who consorts with a native man in a family-like situation shall have the same rights in relation to that man as that man's own children. And we all sort of took to heart the fact that one of the patriarchal things that was happening in South Africa was that there was perpetual minority for Black women. It was not from customary law. It was from a colonial statute, misunderstanding the nuances and the dynamics of an African family and how they work things out so that everyone has got space. The markers that identify living customary law include the following. One, it is part of the oral cultural tradition, unwritten principles and rules based largely on custom and passed down from generation to generation. Secondly, it is distinguished from custom, though, by the fact that it is not merely habitual behavior, but behavior that is followed because it is believed to be binding by the people who practice it. Thirdly, for this reason, living customary law is an example of a normative system developed from the bottom up rather than from the top down. It is not the command of a sovereign, hence the persistent Western skepticism as to whether it is law at all. Living law is also recognized as adaptable and always developing. Furthermore, it is not set up in a systematic classificatory category style as common law. Komarov and Roberts are famous for characterizing it properly when they called it, I quote, an amorphous and undifferentiated repertoire of norms of varying specificity and value, mainly referring to its ability to morph between very specific rules and relatively wide general principles to very detailed injunctions and back again. So what have we got here then? We've got something called living law. Its major characteristics are that it is what people in communities do now, and that it is acceptable for it not to look like anything that has been the case before. And so to qualify as law, the practice that is, for instance, alleged in litigation in a court of law is one, it must be proved to exist, which in turn implies identifying the actual community or group where the practice has been observed, and whether it is claimed to be a long-standing tradition or practice, or whether it is claimed to be of recent origin. It must have been recognized in a particular community. Number two, it must be followed because it is believed to be obligatory, that is to say binding, and therefore not merely custom, tradition, habit, or fashion. And thirdly, it must not breach the provisions of the Constitution. That, ladies and gentlemen, in sum, is living customary law. So for one thing, to call it living law does not mean that every practice actually observed in a community qualifies to be applied as law. It must not breach the Constitution. A good example is indaba yokuthwala. I think you know about this yourselves. Ukuthwala is the sort of ostensible, well, it's the kidnapping really of young girls ostensibly for purposes of marriage. If you used only the criterion that it must be observed as being actually prevalent in a particular community, you would be short of fully saying, therefore, it is the law. In other words, there can be bad living law. Bad living law is when, although prevalent, it does not comply with the Constitution. That, I think, is where I want to leave the issue of what is this law that we are talking about. I want to move now to what then are the issues in relation to customary law. And basically, if one were to ask the ordinary South African in the street what they thought about customary law, the answers would probably run the gamut of perspectives and emotions, ranging from enthusiastic approval of this law to scathing criticism of this law, depending on where the person is coming from, and separated in between by deep-seated confusion as to what it is in any case. And the reason that the feelings tend to run so high is actually quite easy to come by. I assume it's because the ordinary South African in the streets believes that he or she knows customary law, and what they are now in this modern time hearing seeing, perceiving, suffering, or having to tolerate is an aberration, a distortion of what they believe to be customary law. That is why I put as the first of my role players, us, the people, and to try and at least tease out the confusion that we feel when we have to talk about customary law. Ordinary people, the most topical customary law subject in the country today is the issue of marriage, particularly the issue of the essentials for the validity of customary marriages. If you open a paper, if you read articles, journal submissions, and so on, it's all about what exactly is the essential requirement for a customary marriage. So, for instance, it seems that it is now clear from evidence that most of the mischief comes from the families of deceased men who are willing to go to court to seek the invalidation of the customary marriage in which their kinsman was involved in his lifetime. In simple terms, the approach is usually to deny the widow the status of daughter-in-law, so that she and the children have no say in the distribution of the deceased estate. In other countries, they call it property grabbing. In pursuit of this project, the overwhelming majority of cases feature the strategy of denying that the practices and rituals that are supposed to constitute a valid marriage were performed, or that they were performed correctly. With regard, for instance, to the requirement of the payment of ilobolo or the transfer of ilobolo, issues likely to be contested include the claim that ilobolo was not discussed, ilobolo was not paid, or it was not paid in full, or it was not even paid in part, or that sometimes objectors will claim ilobolo was paid to the wrong recipient. For example, the mother of the bride instead of the father or other male relative. They will question the composition of the negotiating delegations or raise any other such issues questioning the integrity of the process. One should not spend a lot of time here. There are many examples. I have to confess that my favorite one comes from the case of Southern versus Muropane, where there was consensus between the two families that ilobolo had been properly negotiated, that ilobolo had been agreed upon, and that the agreement, according to custom, had been properly acknowledged with the slaughter of small livestock, sheep or goat. So you would have thought, well, this is fine. Everybody agrees, except that a conflict arose. It arose because the objectors to the marriage being valid agreed that all of this had happened and all of it was fine, except that when the beast was slaughtered, the slaughterer used the wrong knife. That's the problem. So a lot of the time when we are talking about us as ordinary people, some of those issues are the ones that come to the fore. I move to my second constituency or role player. Remember, we're still asking the question, how far is this thing called customary law either already embedded or on its way towards being a permanent part and a good part of our legal system? The courts, well, simply because of the litigation and the volume of it in this country, emanating mainly from the examples given above, the judiciary bears its own heavy load or even the brunt of attention just the cases on marriage alone account for the bulk of the decisions that make the headlines. But this presentation is not really mainly only about marriage. In fact, to be fair to the judiciary, one needs to look at the role of the courts in setting the foundations for the questions raised by our topic today. And in my humble opinion, South African courts at all levels, and of course, especially most powerfully at constitutional court level, have been a bulwark of strength in defending and promoting customary law. Below here, I discuss some judgments that have been instrumental in cementing the place of customary law in the legal system, usually by interpreting the language of the Constitution in favor of customary law and thereby securing the rights of citizens. The early Constitutional Court judgments we've talked about. The one that I'd like to dwell a little on, at least as far as the foundational early stages of interpreting Section 11, 211, subsection 3, the recognition section, was the case of Shilubana versus Nwamitwa, which was a vital constitutional court pronouncement. It's got some controversy around it for different reasons, because it was about traditional leadership and chieftainship. But the impact lay not only in its confirmation of the decision by a royal council that they were entitled to decide to alter the rule that only a male can be chief and to give the throne to a daughter of the deceased instead. But also importantly, they developed guidelines about how to approach the phenomenon called living customary law in practice. Everybody had said, Justice Pius Langa had said in the majority decision in Bear versus the magistrate Kailicha that we applaud the fact that our courts have opted for living customary law instead of official customary law, but proving living customary law is going to be the problem. It's very, very difficult because it requires research. But in Shilubana, Justice Johan van der Westhuizen said, and I quote, I'll take this slowly because I think it's really very important. The legal status of customary law norms cannot depend simply on their having been consistently applied in the past, because this is a test which any new development must necessarily fail. Development implies some departure from the past. A rule that requires absolute consistency with past practice before a court will recognize the existence of a customary norm would therefore prevent the recognition of new developments as customary law. This would result in the courts applying laws which communities themselves no longer follow and would stifle the recognition of the new rules adopted by the communities. Very clear indication that if we are saying living customary law is what communities do today now, adapted to their economic circumstances, to climate change, to drought, to matters that matter to them now, they will move the norms and believe and obey new ones. So if you start off by saying things like the colonials used to say in cases like Van Brita versus Jacobs, a time immemorial, that is out of the window. You can no longer be seeking things that have been being done over time immemorial if you are in fact adopting living customary law. But in addition to these foundational pronouncements, I think it is really proper to give due credit where credit is due. in the way the courts have really fought the good fight for the common person as far as customary law is concerned. Remember, we're talking about judgments relating to customary law. And basically, to cut through quite quickly, some of the judgments relating to the extractive industries, particularly mining, if you recall Maledu versus Itireleng Bakhatla mineral resources, the Constitutional Court produced an important ruling on the rights of a traditional community to be consulted before they are deprived of their land, and went further to prescribe how such consultation should be conducted in order to count. Cases along the same lines that fell in support of the people, for instance, as opposed to leaders, include Baleni versus the Minister for Mineral Resources. They include Lamosa or Land Access Movement of South Africa and others versus chairperson of the National Council of Provinces. There is a case I want to get to when I go to our third constituency, and that is Gongose and others versus Minister of Agriculture and others. And also Mohale and others versus the Speaker of the National Assembly. They are important, but we'll talk about them in the next section. I would like to end this one, the courts. Remember, we started with us as people trying to see what the problems were. We're now looking at the courts and what their role has been. And my sense is that it's been more positive than negative. And one wants to conclude this by remembering that courts, of course, are not necessarily perfect. And sometimes they are vulnerable to predictable differences of opinion about the outcomes that they produce. This begins to explain the first cluster of issues, which I characterized under the heading of our behaviors as citizens and as society in general. Because we do not necessarily have access to the legal processes described above, more familiar to legal professionals than to many lay people, and because many of us grow up with a grasp of customary law based on our own oral traditions and cultural upbringing, we may experience difficulty in distinguishing between our own imbibed cultural mores and the workings of a modern legal system whose dominant components are by and large alien to our cultural norms, and consequently in appreciating the complexities facing the courts. The result is that we are likely to be critical of the outcomes of judicial deliberations, perhaps in harsher tones than are warranted by the real problems that the courts face. It should come as no surprise to you that when we get to the conclusion, I will probably be opting in favor of the answer, yes, they get our courts a passing mark in the question we're asking in this lecture. Are we embedding customary law according to the cultural diversity and the fair practice and post-apartheid society that Albert Luthuli and his generation hankered after? Here comes the big one, the third constituency, Parliament, the legislature. It's a difficult one to describe. It's the longest part of my paper. We don't have the time to go through all of the niceties and the difficulties. But by some measures, the role of Parliament in preserving, strengthening, promoting, and embedding customary law in the legal system is almost as crucial as that of the judiciary. Indeed, except for the Constitutional Court, which of course had the first crack at interpreting the language of the new constitution, Parliament should be leading the charge. This is because Parliament's mandate is to make law for the good of the country. In executing that mandate, Parliament's role in taking care of the new baby in the family, namely customary law, would appear to be obvious. But my sense is that the story is less heartening, with perhaps more questions than answers. The problem appears to be that there have been different phases in the product of the legislature since 1994, with an early phase that promised much for the topic that we're discussing this afternoon, in that the laws passed at that time seemed to have a genuine intention to do good. This phase would include the attempts to comply with the various provisions of Section 25 of the Constitution relating to land. By all accounts, this phase was laudable, and the idea persists that enactments by Parliament during this time were sincere in their attempts to comply with the transformation or transformative injunctions of the Constitution. And that's where they failed. The fault lay not with Parliament, but with implementation by government, sometimes due to lack of resources and therefore lack of capacity. The next phase, in my considered opinion, became somewhat problematic, in that the legislative product became increasingly detached from the needs of the populace, particularly rural people. What immediately comes to mind are those attempts by Parliament to regulate traditional leaders and customary courts, which became battlegrounds between the legislature and the people for whom the laws were intended. There have also been other quite technical missteps in Parliament's understanding of the requirements of the Constitution in relation to when and how Parliament should intervene in customary law. Evidence of these challenges can be found in the convoluted history of the Traditional Courts Bill, from this earliest version in 2008 that was roundly rejected by rural populations, which was followed by a series of versions starting from 2012, which were quietly dropped when again they drew spirited resistance, finally culminating in a 2017 version. That version was thoroughly debated, and for a while there was hope that the opposing sides had found each other, until Parliament reverted back to the provisions that had caused the conflict in the first place in a bill which has now been passed by both houses of Parliament, and in fact is just awaiting the President's signature to become law. Not so topical are examples which I shall come to of the gray area in the relationship between the courts and the legislature, when the latter, the legislature, appears not to comprehend fully its role, even when guidance is provided by the courts. For this latter phase, I wish to highlight just three matters in attempting to make the point that the legislature has some corrective work to do to honor the Constitution's vision of customary law. One, these corrective things that I'm talking about. The legislature has to correct the tendency to cut corners in respect of process, especially on the question of public consultation. When they develop legislation, because that leads to the invalidation of these enactments by the Constitutional Court. Number two, there also have been debates, I will not say questions, but just exchanges of opinion, debates about missed opportunities to protect living law by hesitating to restrict too hasty a default to common law when things get difficult. There is a lot of writing, a lot of ink has been spent on the subject of things that the legislature could have done better by starting a reform from the value system of customary law, and simply instead just drawing from even a statute of the apartheid era. Let's start with the process thing. I won't take too much time. We all know this. The parliament and legislation emanating from it have been invalidated and set aside on processual grounds, simply because the culture of the current parliament, as far as consultation with constituencies, provincial, province-wide, nationwide, in all provinces, is actually pretty bad. One example, there are many, is of course the case of Mukhale and others versus the Speaker of the National Assembly and others, where the Constitutional Court has just struck down the TKLA, the Traditional Khoisan Leadership Act, number 3 of 2019, holding that the National Assembly and provincial legislatures failed to fulfill their constitutional obligation to reasonably facilitate public participation in its passing. They highlighted deficiency in the public participation process, including inadequate notice, lack of pre-hearing education, and limited accessibility of hearings. If you talk to NGOs who actually monitor both deliberations in Parliament and the consultation process countrywide, you would be surprised. The consultations that get ticked off when they get back to Parliament as having been consultations according to law are sometimes, quite honestly, just a farce. You get bullying, you get people being refused to talk, particularly if the chair of the process is a man and a woman is trying to talk. There have been horrendous recorded stories of the fact that sometimes a hearing has simply been about a parade of politicians coming in, speaking leadership talk and leaving, people breaking for lunch, and the meeting closing thereafter. So consultation is an issue. It is probably not right if legislation aimed at improving the lives of South Africans keeps consistently being turned down by the Constitutional Court simply because they were not consulted upon properly with any seriousness of listening to the people and taking their views into account. The other one, about after process, you remember we said missed opportunities for using living law as a starting point of new legislation. I should explain something here, with your permission, Mr. Program Director. What I've done in this particular lecture is not to worry about my own ego and to worry simply about the points that one wants to make. If somebody else makes the point better than I can make it, I happily embrace some of that. And there are two cases here that I do wish you to keep, about which I do wish you to keep that in mind. The first is basically a very strong criticism by one Diana Ndima in his LLT thesis, where he analyzes the case of Nonkululeko Bhenge versus the magistrate Kayelicha, where the court did several things. It ruled to be unconstitutional and therefore to be set aside the customary law succession rule of male primogeniture, namely that only firstborn males should inherit. But it also said that the time that people have been suffering under this is so far gone that we cannot wait for new research to start afresh. So it instituted the Interstate Succession Act, but cleaned up by the law, by the court itself, to say, without this, without that, we strike that down. But that could be a starting point. But then thirdly, said to the parliament, go off and draft a new succession statute. And what Ndima, for the whole, or in part of his thesis, worries about is that even though the male primogeniture rule that was ruled unconstitutional was the official rule, not living law, the parliament went off and instead of realizing that the court, in striking down the official rule, this was setting the stage for the affirmation of the living version. Instead, it put together the RCLSA, a long name, which is for the Reform of Customary Law of Succession Act number 11 of 2009, and basically reproduced the Interstate Succession Act. That is one. I will pass to my third point about what is worrisome about the process of the legislature in some of these matters relating to customary law. No one is saying the legislature is churning out bad legislation. It is just getting to a point where, as far as customary law is concerned, the legislation is dubious. But the third one is there is also a suspicion that there is a misunderstanding, a confusion about the relationship between the Constitution and what you can do as Parliament, staying in your lane in our system of separation of powers, which is quite fine. But there seems to be misunderstanding about what Parliament can do to interfere or to intervene in legislation. So much so that if you read the minutes of portfolio committee meetings or hearings at Parliament, you will find that some of the arguments that have been produced have had to do with a rather scary thought that in some cases, the legislature thinks that ordinary customary law is not viable as a law until it has had the head of legislation on it. There are some cases, or at least some arguments, some minutes one can quote, which raise the specter of the fact that maybe there is a misunderstanding about whether there is a standalone customary law that is valid. And I think one can very quickly say that that would be a frightening interpretation of the Constitution, if that was correct. If you think about it, Section 39, subsection 3 of the Constitution says that there is nothing wrong with customary law. It is valid, it is operable and operative if it does not breach the Bill of Rights. So if it doesn't, it is what people do as Lalin and elsewhere all the time. Neighbor disputes, headmen hearing quarrels, traditional councils hearing quarrels, because there is no need for it to be touched by legislation before it can be real, valid, and implementable. So the case I want to bring to your attention, I will not have time to discuss it fully, is this one about Kongose, but in particular, I want to acknowledge the fact that I take this from a wonderful article, or his wonderfully argued article by Advocate Michael Bishop, who tells the story that 3 fishermen from the communities that live in and around the Dwesa Nature Reserve, David Kongose, Usipumile Windase, and Gosipendule Chuza, convicted in 2012 for fishing in a reserve when that reserve had been declared by the minister a no-take area. And all that they were doing were fishing because there was an actual customary law fishing right. It took 6 years to actually establish that simple proposition. But let me quote 2 things from Bishop that I'd like to leave in our minds. This fisher's story reflects a tension in democratic South Africa about the place of customary law. Despite express constitutional protection, customary law and customary rights are often disregarded by policymakers, legislators, and courts. For many communities, it is a constant struggle to ensure that the recognition of the status or to ensure the recognition of the status of their customary law as law. He also says the Kongose judgment entrenches the position of customary law in the constitutional framework. It confirms for the first time, that was in 2018, what is said plainly in section 211, subsection 3 of the Constitution, namely that a customary law cannot be overridden by legislation that does not specifically deal with customary law. Kongose reveals that these rights continue to exist despite legislative regulations, unless the statute expressly or by necessary implication alters those rights. He ends with, I argue that the protection of Kongose affords customary law is very powerful, but primarily procedural. Its most important contribution is to force the legislature to engage directly with customary law when it legislates in an area that might affect that law. If it does not, the legislation cannot extinguish the customary law rights, which will continue to exist on an equal footing with the legislation. It does seem that when you put all of these together, basically what should be happening is that whenever legislation trumps a customary law right, it must revert to section 36, the limitation clause, because it is saying there is a right here, but we claim the customary law right to limit that right. But remember, section 36 will require that Parliament should apply its mind to the nature of the right, the purpose of the limitation and its importance, the nature and extent of the limitation, and whether the limitation will achieve the stated purpose, and finally, whether there is no less intrusive way to achieve the purpose. What all this implies is that in embarking on legislation involving customary law, Parliament must show that it has paid attention to the customary law that it seeks to regulate in order to grasp the nature of the extent of that limitation. To put this another way, the legislature should understand the customary law that it seeks to regulate so as to be able to use the living law as a starting point and thereby to find the least intrusive way of intervening in it. And I end that by saying that is food for thought. Remember, the least intrusive way, that language comes from the dissenting judgment of Judge Sandile Ngcobo in the Bear case, who said problem with the majority view in doing what they did, which was to knock down the official version of primogeniture, was then no other least intrusive way of dealing with customary law. In other words, to knock it down only when that is the last resort. If there are other ways, we do not know. I cannot claim that there is, for me, an answer to that, but I would like now to lead to the conclusion. And I conclude in this form. We started off attempting to assess what the position of customary law in our democracy is, as an equal partner with statute law and common law in the legal system. From the outset, this was not a lecture about customary law and its principles and rules, but rather about its place in South Africa's legal universe. And many of us believe that it would be good for the country if this place is secure and provides a basis for this culture-based value system to become embedded within the legal landscape. We have had to accept that of the selected role players, some have had a more onerous task in this regard than others, but that we all have something to contribute to the project of making the vision of a humane and dignified society that was held by Inkosi Albert Luthuli a reality. So in concluding this presentation, it seems only fair to summarize my sense of what our assessment of these role players has been about, in the hopes that we may be encouraged to move forward with more purpose if we at least have been helped to understand what the pitfalls are. Our first role players, remember, were us as individuals. As individuals, as citizens, we are sometimes faced with a dilemma. We know customary law. It was drummed into us from birth, but we are sometimes at a loss as to what our knowledge means in the context of a modern constitution and an equally modern legal system. And at times we move forward exploiting every available loophole in order to get our way in this plurality of norms. The examples I shared from the area of marriage are but the tip of the iceberg. In other incarnations, we struggle with what culture means in our lives. I am reluctant to be overly critical of our confusion. The pluralism of normative options brought about by colonial conquest always destabilizes anyway. But in trying to find our feet, I would hope that we rally around those cultural values that emphasize the foundations of dignity and humanity that Albert Luthuli talked about. If we do that, we would see why, for instance, gender discrimination is a direction to deviate from, not to follow slavishly as a cultural entitlement. That is basically my sense of where we are with us as individuals. The second constituency was the courts, where I conclude our courts are doing much better. They are not perfect, but it would be extremely mean-minded not to acknowledge their demonstrated desire to welcome customary law into the legal fold, and a human and dignifying customary law at that. It will take a considerable amount of time, perhaps not even in our generation, to guide the cultural ship into safer waters, constitutionally speaking, but I personally wish them well in the task. Finally, our legislature does a lot of good work, but always appears to struggle when it comes to customary law. In fairness, distinguishing between the principles and rules of customary law on the one hand, and its constitutional entitlement to develop unmolested on the other hand, to develop customary law unmolested on the other hand, is a very difficult task indeed, fraught with legal niceties and technicalities, and it was never going to be easy. But some things are doable. To be reprimanded by the Constitutional Court on several occasions for failing to take seriously the consultation of South Africans on laws that are meant to govern them is not an auspicious track record. My own considered opinion is that Parliament is buffeted by winds of change, where there has developed a serious contestation between those who see customary law as a top-down and authoritative enterprise or authoritarian enterprise, valorizing leadership rather than people on the one hand, and those who believe that African values, animated as they always were by the wholesome worldview of Ubuntu, are first and foremost consensual, people-centered, and bottom-up in their conception. That this tension plays itself out in legislation is to be regretted, but I have no doubt in my mind that the higher moral ground lies in the latter visualization of customary law. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed, Professor. Thank you so much. A big hand, ladies and gentlemen. Professor Nhlapo. Wow. Okay, so I know for some of you, some of it was a bit academic, but I think there were important threads that came through and raised some curiosity for some of us as well in listening to words like living law, customary law, and common law. And I think our respondent is going to help us a little bit now, just to unpack some of that. But it is a difficult area, I think, and perhaps we're unfair to you, Professor, to try and condense that into a short lecture. Perhaps this is the kind of thing that's discussed over a term in school. But I think it's given us food for thought. And as custodians of our customs and traditions, we're passionate about them. And it's good to get an understanding of where it all sits in our daily lives. So when we do the Q&A, the question and answer session just now, perhaps you can pose some questions directly and say, this is who I am, this is my situation, this is what's important to me. Where does that fit in the law today? And we'll explore that. So please make sure you've written your questions. Our ushers will collect those questions from you and we'll pose them to our professor and the respondent just now. Okay, so please write your questions. We're going to collect them shortly. In the meantime, to help us make sense of what we've just heard a little bit further, is Advocate Vusi Kuzwaya, who himself has more than 32 years practical experience in most fields of law. He was admitted to practice in South Africa in Lesotho. He's a member of the General Bar Council of South Africa since 1991, a practicing member of the Durban Bar Council since 1992, and he's acted as a judge several times. But he's gone beyond the ordinary confines of a legal practitioner, often has worked in fields such as governance, human resource management, industrial and labor relations, and investigations. Ladies and gentlemen, as our key respondent today, please put your hands together for Advocate Vusi Kuzwaya, SC. Good luck.
Afternoon, everybody. I think it's a big feat. Standing here, I think everyone who's been here except the program director is either a professor or a doctor. So I must first make my own disclaimer that I'm neither a writer nor an author, but I'm an African and I'm a lawyer. The topic which Professor Nhlapo has, I think, eloquently dissected for our own benefit, as the program director says, it's not even a term. I mean, if you heard when he was chair of the Nhlapo Commission, it's a project that didn't run for a year. It ran for months. So the topic, as he has dissected for us, I think mine is not to rehash what he has said. I think I don't want to spoil the Honorable Professor's work, but it's just to touch on three elements that I've picked up from his talk today. We all grow, as he says, we grow, we claim that we know customary law. And we all know that democracy was ushered. The writings of Chief Albert Luthuli, they contributed to the kind of a constitution that we do have. What probably the prof was indicating on the three elements he touched on, because he said it's us, the people, and then he said the courts, and then he gave I think it's not a challenge, but he just presented to us, I think, where we probably need to get, I think, more assistance, or should be more resources in ensuring that customary law takes its rightful place in the legal space. If one uses lawyers, I think, because that is always the easiest thing if you're a lawyer to make yourself as an example. We come from the very same communities where these customs are being practiced. And that is why if you were to find an opportunity to go through the majority of the cases which Prof was relating to, they, in the majority, are cases penned down by African judges, because it's people who come from the communities, people who grew, who observed these practices being implemented and passed from generation to generation. So it's not default that when it comes to the judgments, when it comes to the writings, the majority of the writers in the subject, when they do write, they share what their views are, but in the main, they stick to what they understand the custom to have been, and then they will now and then go to case law, because cases, they guide the next decision that needs to be written. That is also by no mistake that you'll find that the bare judgment, the one which against Khayelitsha, in my recollection, that judgment, when it came to the High Court, it is Ujeram Ngwenya, who was the judge who penned down the High Court judgment. And you will then see what roles then such individuals would play in the community in order to to promote and ensure that customary law gets its rightful place. We in the judiciary, what has helped is that there has been I think a focused and intensified approach to ensure that there is transformation in the judiciary. I'm not saying it's a complete exercise, but I'm just sharing with you that when you were to ask yourself if the past Langes, if the Sandile Ngobos did not rise to be in the Constitutional Court, would we have had such insightful judgments on the very question of what impacted the customary law that we probably know of. So again, it is those steps that got taken. It is those steps that led to them finding themselves presiding in those high court and in those very important judgments. Indeed, they are human, so you will find in the judgment probably something that you would disagree with. But what is common in my just analysis of what UPROF was sharing with us is that we come from the community, we become judges, we sit, we hear important matters, and then we write judgments. And it is these judgments that seeks to then guide what the future nature of disputes hold and how it could be traversed. Because at the end of the day, when we have democracy, we all wish that there should be no dispute that are questioning why we went the constitutional route. But that's not the point today. So when Prof says to us, the courts have done their best, I agree. I endorse what the Prof is saying. And then when the Prof says, I think where we need to see some effort being really put in is the legislature. And it is the very same courts who are cutting the legislature to say, these are the areas you should focus on. These are the kind of processes that the Constitution has enabled you to use as guides in order to ensure that those communities, which is what Prof was telling us as the first element, need to be consulted, get their views, get to understand what is their customary law practice of today that you would want to pass into a legislation in the future. So in a nutshell, if everything is equal, I don't think there is as of today, we should be having legislation that is struck off by the Constitutional Court for a mere failure to consult with us, the people. And another trend which actually has probably developed, which I think is what is crippling some processes in the legislative processes, is that there are some interest groups, some of them, they form NGOs and they get funded. That's why when Prof was saying, whenever these consultation processes are convened, you would find a very vibrant session where somebody who just stands up and talks about the customary law, which is that official law, because that person is standing and is in the midst of the consultation process to ensure that what they believe should be our customary law is not lost from what they had written for us. So those are some of the challenges that really exist. And perhaps one bit of a homework for the for our host is to ascertain through their own resources how best they can utilize the existing resources. We have many retired professors who still have the energy. We also, Prof. Nhlapo, nobody was helping him to walk up the steps. On his way down, he actually was doing what any ordinary human being would do. So there is still life. There is wisdom in him. And there are many others. And if probably there could be there could be a thinking of what could we do if we do come together and pull these resources in order to influence policy, because policy is influenced at the legislature level. Because this is where I think I see where the ball seems to be bumping outside the court without it being kicked by a person who ought to be kicked, because that is the area where when these matters are now in court, you now find an eloquent lawyer who says he or she represent the amicus, which is a friend of the court. So these friends of the court, they come from funded organizations that would not want to see the customary law take its rightful place. I think I wouldn't want to spoil the words that the Prof has shared with us. Indeed, cases are available. So what we probably need to indicate to the host is a focus on what could be done to add as a resource to that legislative element. Thank you, Program Director.
Thank you very much indeed, Advocate Kuzwayo, SC, for helping us again further explore these complex issues, yet issues that directly affect us and our way of life and our way of being as Africans on this continent. And I look forward to our conversation, which we'll be having shortly as we respond to some of the questions that will be posed by our audience. And we're going to have a moment once again with I Grandi Tenori to share with us a piece of music. But whilst they do that, please can I ask you to write your questions. And when you've got your question ready, please raise it in the air so that our ushers can collect the questions from you. Okay, so use this opportunity. I don't think you were meant to understand this on a level of writing a thesis in academic terms, but rather, what does it mean for me? What I've heard today, how does it affect me? This is what we've been doing all our lives. 94 came, they sat down, they wrote something called the Constitution. How did the game change? And how has it been changing since then? And what does it mean for me? These, I think, are perhaps some of the questions even our audience watching online might be able to pose. And let's hear from our esteemed colleagues. We have a whole advocate of decades stature and a heavyweight in legal academics who'll be able to put that into context for you. Okay, in the meantime, let's enjoy this rich talent, which is I Grandi Tenori.
The stars are brightly shining. It is the night of our dear Savior's birth. Long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared, and the soul felt its worth.
I lost the world rejoices, for your glorious, and your glorious
When Christ was born, he holy night, the stars brightly shining, it is the light of our dear Savior's birth. Long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared, and the soul felt its worth.
But we somewhere in the rejoices, for your glorious, and glorious
When Christ was born, he was
All right, I think we can do a lot better than that in terms of appreciating this massive talent. Wow. Fantastic. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, it's time to get through to those questions now. And if I could ask to join us on stage, Advocate Vusi Kuzwayo and also Professor Nhlapo to come and sit on the hot seat and face the music. And Advocate Kuzwayo has decreased his normal fee of 500,000 Rand a day to free of charge today to answer your questions. Right. Okay. So I'm going to put on my glasses to make sure we get the right questions in through here. So, gentlemen, I think you can decide amongst yourselves who might answer these particular questions, but let's start with this one. What is the role of customary law to protect women, widows who live in land under the Ingonyama Trust when chiefs and Izinduna try to dispossess their land after their husbands have passed away?
I think the question on Ingonyama trust held land has received attention. The latest attention, I think it came from a judgment which I think it was in the Natal Provincial Division. It escapes me, but I think the applicants were ladies in the same category and plight I think you're referring to. They actually challenged the issue of what we call they used to be PTOs, this permission to occupy, and then they were then converted into some leases. So what Ingonyama Trust Board was doing, they were issuing these leases, and some would default, and some the Ingonyama Trust would attempt to evict. And in the majority of the affected individuals, it were I think the widows, people whose husband, others have passed away, others have left them. As we all know, we bring women into our family, and when we decide to go through a small window, you leave them behind. So it was that kind of an environment. So what the court then did, the court just dealt with that issue, and it was declared as something which is unconstitutional. So what the Ingonyama Trust, I would say, board then did, they sought leave to appeal, and the matter I think was supposed to be heard in the SCA, and the Ingonyama Trust has since withdrawn its challenge. So the way I understand is that those affected individuals, their rights are protected.
Because it says never married on the death certificate. How can this be rectified? It infringes upon the dignity of those spouses as well as the families, children of such unions.
Thank you. I think I'll take this one simply because recently I have had occasion to be thoroughly amazed at the things that go on at Home Affairs. There are so many interpretations of the regulations that Home Affairs makes. Home Affairs is a partner to the Department of Justice in areas where the regulations for doing some of these things. And as far as I know, a lot of what they do is in fact wrong. In addition to that, there is evidence of people who walk in seeking a certificate for a customary marriage, who are persuaded to walk out holding a certificate of a civil marriage. So basically, Home Affairs, that is a mess.
Professor Mayiwa, thank you so much for this one. I know you've been left despondent. She asks, where to from here, from all of this mess led by the state legislatures? Is there anything that citizens can do in the near future for the rightful place of the living law to finally reclaim Ubuntu and rightful humanizing of women and girl children in particular?
Yes, I think it's that part which I think, according to Prof, the failing element in the legislature. As we all know, our system of appointing the legislatures is based on this multi-party democracy. And as a result, what we do find in the legislature are our representatives, I think, appointed in terms of party lists. What in my view is missing is an element that makes provision for saying in the list you should have people with the following, I think, competencies. Because when you look at what we have so much written on the value of customary law. And when these failings are now exposed, they would still be going back to the same legislation constituted in the form it was before for instance, the Constitutional Court has struck down their own legislation. So it's like going to square zero. So it's that element where one says, hey, I think some resources probably need to be put together to then have a voice wherein you can influence policy. Because we now know that when a new legislation is about to be passed, there will be those consultations, and we guaranteed now that the legislature will ensure that they follow the due processes in terms of consultation. Hence, this suggestion that if we were to be resourced to then ensure that when those consultations are now being held, we are there to make this necessary input, which in my view would offer, I think, probably better resources in terms of the outcome of the legislation.
Okay, now this next question, I'm not going to pose to you because it's unfair, but the chairperson of the Luthuli Museum Council, this lecture was delivered in English, but most people attending speak isiZulu. Why is that? The topic is customary law, and it's likely that most people would have understood it better in Zulu. Mr. Chairperson.
Kodwa okubalekile ukuthi baningi abantu abalandela ama lectures ka Chief Albert Luthuli abaqhamuka outside of the province of KwaZulu Natal. So the lectures are conducted in English simply to accommodate as many people as possible who come outside of this province who cannot speak or understand isiZulu. But as I say, I think it's an important question. As the council will think about it, maybe in the future we'll consider bringing a translator who would actually translate the lecture in isiZulu. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So the next question, is customary law today and in the future looks valid for the youth as it but oh my goodness. So whoever wrote this question, please come and talk to me in my ear. Mr. Nkosinati Dludla. You have permission to approach the throne. In the meantime, I'm curious myself personally, though, is what needs to catch up with what? Customary law, does it need to catch up with the Constitution, catch up with, or is it the chicken before the egg? Because they're coming from different angles, I get a sense. And our legislatures are not Zulu. They're not all Pedi. They're not all. So they've got this task of trying to come up with a law for all people. But then we have all these interests at local level. Who needs to move forward? Okay.
Ngicela ukubona ukuthi it's customary today. The future looks very for the youth as it remains unemployed in terms of monetary issues as the world costs. Ngiyabonga, ngizophendula. No, I think I understand the question. It says it's customary law today and in future looking valid for the youth as it remains unemployed in terms of monetary issues as lobolo costs enormously. In answer, I guess one should start off by saying it is not really a matter of customary law. It is a matter of a range of policies that look to improve the economic position of the youth. But I don't want to duck the question by leaving it there. It seems to me that what was animating my thinking in the principles that went into the lecture was that the day to look forward to is in any case a customary law that looks after the interests of everybody. When all is said and done, all of the issues that were raised, and I'm happy to say added to positively by our discussant, are aimed at getting to a point where customary law is imparting to the earlier partners, common law statute, its own values that are more humanitarian and humane. And that would be the answer. The answer would not lie in customary law single-handedly improving the economic position of the youth. Thanks.
All right. Yep.
Yeah, I think I can also add some, I think because Prof spoke about Gongose judgment, because it related to fishing rights, where I think a permit was subsequently now a requirement. But eventually the three accused, their fate was determined based on the fact that it was customary practice for them to wake up, go and fish before a permit. So in a nutshell, ababengenayo inhloso yokuphula umthetho. So they had no intention of breaking any law. So if you then take that forward, it was customary law, not in the context of lobola and all that, but it was customary law in the context of them accessing a way of living. So their life would then continue, because when you fish, you get a fish, you sell a fish.
All right. Curious is we have common law, judges make judgments and they set precedents. And senior advocates such as yourself then use those precedents to argue cases. Do chiefs have the same power when they make a judgment at local level? Is that precedent setting?
I think we may share this with Advocate Kuzwayo, who knows more about courts than I do. But I do want to problematize the issue of precedent in relation to customary law. I'll come to your traditional leaders next. The first item I wish to problematize is whether, in fact, in the context of living customary law, there is still a role for precedent of the common law type, which is quite strict, considering similarity of facts, seniority of the hierarchy, and the others below there being just bound. I have a sense that the very nature of living customary law probably precludes precedent. In any case, African jurisprudence is, like weaving a rug. You weave any design you want, given the answer or the effect you want to have. If people are neighbors and the court values the relationship and that it should remain, they will give one judgment. Next week, same facts come before them, but that aspect is not there. They feel free to give a different judgment. The simple answer in relation to traditional courts is basically no. Until we do succeed to finalize a Traditional Courts Act, the issue is in the air.
Yes, I think I think once, as Prof says, the act has been enacted, thereafter, because that's where we then build that first element of us as community, because us as community, our disputes are actually heard by a chief's court. And if you look at the trend now, there is even a payment that local government is now paying to the traditional leader structures below Amakos. So I think I'm optimistic that once there is a proper, I think, legislation law, so I think it would take its place.
Okay. Question here. What can be done to impress the will of Parliament to focus on public participation on customary practices?
Yes. In other countries, I think it's a process of influencing policy. It's when the elected public leaders do come to their respective communities and hear their views on what and how they want to be represented. I think in the olden days, in America, they raised a simple question: no taxation without participation. So at some point, I think us as communities, we may find that we may not be rising against, but we must exercise that choice into who represents us. So we will have that. And if you follow the recent Constitutional Court decision on who can now participate as a representative, once we have 1,000 signatures. So I think we're slowly going to find public representatives who care, who actually come and listen to us, because the number is very low in order to qualify to register.
All right, so last couple of questions. Professor Nhlapo, what happened to your efforts to protect girls against ukutwala?
I'm not quite sure if that is a trick question. But it's a very valid one. In this room, there is at least one, maybe two members of the committee that I chaired, which was the project on Ugutwala. That project produced a report to the minister, which had a bill attached to it, as is the usual practice at the South African Law Reform Commission. That bill, if I recall, was called Prohibition of Forced Marriages and Related Matters. I can safely say, with my hand on my heart, or even a stack of Bibles, that nothing has been done about that. 2 ministers now, since the one we reported to, nothing has been had. It was even more frightening when, in preparing for a new bit of legislation, one of these 2 ministers didn't even know that the report existed.
All right, here's an interesting question. Do we need to remind the current leadership and parliament of the plot? They seem to have lost the plot. Customary law is our identity. It is what defines us.
Amen to that.
Is there any defense for the legislators, and how difficult it must be for them to try and solve the riddle of many cultures, many belief systems, many traditions, which themselves are a moving target? I mean, I'll go to a ilobolo, and depending on the family and where it is, the rules change because people are forgetting. And someone will say, no, 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 this is what must be done. And then someone will say, no, 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 I remember I saw my uncle do this. So the rules are changing even within ourselves. And the legislators, how do they sort that out?
I accept that as a legitimate, proper, and in fact, very good question. I think when it comes right down to it, well, let me start off by confessing the fact that a lot of my thinking on the subject, particularly of consultation, and we'll come to your question, your proper question after that. The consultation story for me resonates simply because one had the good fortune to be in the first post-independence law commission after it was revived. And the chair of that commission was the Chief Justice at the time, Ismail Mohammed, who used to harp on the principle that we should consider ourselves as commissioners when we go out as people who are not making law for South Africans, but who are making law with South Africans. It was very important motivation for us. So if you think of it that way, a mindset shift would have to happen within the legislatures in any case, provincial and national, that this is serious business. Right now, I think it is undermined by lobbies, groups, that kind of thing, which is in any case not a good thing, whether it's South Africa or another country. But also, as you say, the laws are so different. That should not really be a stumbling block to making good laws. If the legislature can actually imbibe and internalize the fact that consultation is one of them, but also simply understanding the Constitution. If it says, look, Amachunu ase when it is, and you actually name a district, because that's what living law now requires, have always done X, Y, Z. And if you can prove that in this area, this is what happens, that would be living law. So it wouldn't really be Parliament needing to put itself in the place of people with different views. Leave that to the courts, who will then interpret what is now meant by living law, which is different from what law meant in the past.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we can congratulate and say thank you very much indeed to Professor Nhlapo and Advocate Kuzwayo. I know that you want to run away, but please, if you could stay there. Oh, your bag. Your bag is not going to be big enough for what we're about to do now. So if you could just stay where you are, and I'd like to call upon also the chairperson of the Luthuli Museum Council, Dr. Mxolisi Mchunu, to join us on stage. The Acting Deputy Director General, Department of Sports and Arts and Culture, Mr. Erwin Langeveld, to join us on stage, because this is one of our fine traditions now at this point, where we commission a young artist to do a painting of Chief Albert Luthuli. And this then is given to our lecturer, guest lecturer, by way of thanks. And just to tell you a little bit about our artist, in fact, can our artist come up? Londani Ngubane, where are you, Londani? Please come up. As Londani comes up, I've got to tell you, this young man, a visual arts student pursuing a master's degree at the moment, you can stand there and just look and be amazed, and let people be amazed by you. A visual arts student pursuing a master's degree in digital art from Empangeni. He took an interest in the visual arts all the way from childhood, and he carried this through high school, and he was guided by his teachers, and then went on to study at the University of KwaZulu Natal, where his passion for the arts saw him thrive. He had a serious accident in 2020 that almost left him completely paralyzed. His vision was impaired. He nearly died, and he was in a coma for something like 6 weeks, right? Yeah, 6 weeks. And you can imagine someone who had this future, it was nearly all taken away. And as fate would have it, he woke up from his coma in the Chief Albert Luthuli Hospital. Yeah. They took care of him, and he would never have known that one day his connection to Chief Albert Luthuli would revisit him when he was invited by the university to do this painting. So there is a spiritual connection, I think, and I believe in his painting, his being here, and him being taken care of at the Chief Albert Luthuli Hospital. If all of these things hadn't have conspired, we wouldn't be here today to recognize him. But ladies and gentlemen, if I could ask you to move closer to the painting, perhaps Professor Nhlapo, you can stand to the one side. And if our artist could stand on the other, quite close by, so that we can see you for sure as the person that, yes. So on three, we are going to unveil the painting as a gift to Professor Nhlapo as a way of thanks. 1, 2, 3. And what a remarkable thing, isn't it, that this young man has been able to do to capture this work of art. Let's give him a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Let's encourage him. Fantastic. Right. Whilst this was don't let go of the song, please let it carry on. One of the favorite songs of Chief Albert Luthuli. I know that the chairperson would like to hand out some small tokens of appreciation as well. All right, they're going to take a couple of more pictures and then I'm going to release them into their own custody. Take your picture quickly. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, a big hand as we say thank you very much indeed for our guests. Thank you so much. And yeah, we've learned a lot today about customary law and its place, our identity, and what our lawmakers need to be doing. And it seems that a radical shift. Thank you, Prof. Oh, okay, your glasses. Is this yours as well? You want some water? All right, so the official parts of everything have come to an end, but one last, I think, act, always very, very important, and that's to hear from the Luthuli family. And it's my great pleasure to ask one of our regulars, for as long as that I've been doing this, Mr. Sandile Luthuli, to join us on stage, perhaps just to say a few final words as we thank him and his family for giving us such a great icon. Mr. Luthuli.
Good afternoon. I might be standing between the room and some refreshments, so I'll try and keep it short. Program Director, our keynote speaker, Professor Nhlapo and Mrs. Nhlapo, Professor Mkhize, our host and key partner, and the broader university community. Sibingelele kwabasendlunkulu bemele isilo samabandla. Our esteemed colleagues from UNISA, Professor Meiwa and Prof. Sikhalo, Advocate Vusi Kuzwayo, SC Mnguni, the acting DDG from the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, Mr. Langefeld, my council members, my fellow council members led by our chairperson, Professor Mchunu, the community of Groundville in particular, who have always embraced not only this lecture, but us as a family as well, distinguished guests. At the beginning of these proceedings, we started with a moment of silence for Rukhabazela. Our patron, Chief Albert Luthuli, himself a traditionalist, would be appalled today by events unfolding in Gaza. It is in this context that I invite you to another moment of silence for the people of Palestine who are being mauled on a daily basis through incessant bombardments as their land is being taken away from them. Shall we observe a moment of silence for the thousands of people that have perished in that senseless war taking place there? Thank you very much. God willing, the mayhem will end. Many of you will not challenge me when I say that the area of customary law, customs and traditions, is a complex one. As Prof said, because of its ever-evolving nature. But Prof Nhlapo has tried this afternoon to help demystify it, particularly by highlighting the role of the different role players. Ultimately, this area of law is about human dignity, our identity, our cultural heritage, the institution of traditional leadership, the role of traditional courts, how land issues are being dealt with and should be dealt with, and many other areas that impact us on a day-to-day basis. It is a recognition that Africans had and continue to have effective systems of governance, written or unwritten, and that these should not be undermined in any way. As I look around the room, I see a number of young people. Professor Nhlapo, our guest speaker today, was a young person in the 60s when he received my grandfather's scholarship. Today, he shared with us his well of wisdom and scholarship. I want to challenge young people in the room and outside of this room never to stop dreaming of a better life. Whatever the circumstances, invest in education and never fail to dream. The lecture was about the recognition of our culture as Africans That is how we have lived our lives in our communities over centuries. Importantly, Prof touched upon critical practices that impact us daily, some of which keep women marginalized and reduce girl children to lesser beings than their brothers. Advocate Kuzwayo's exposition of the practical complexities of these subjects underscores how far we still have to go to claim our South Africanness. Let me pause and reflect. I started off by saying that my grandfather was a traditionalist himself. He is still survived by two daughters, Dr. Albertina Luthuli and Thandeka Luthuli Tsabashi. Both could not join us today due to their advanced age. For their counsel, we remain eternally grateful. I also acknowledge my colleagues in the Luthuli Museum Council. This being one of our flagship events in our year calendar, our anxieties can now subside. As an entity of the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, one must acknowledge the role that various ministers have played in liberation legacy preservation over the years. The current minister, even though he has not held this portfolio for a long time, has continued on that vein and given us incredible support. We extend our gratitude. And Mr. Langeveld, we hope that you will pass this on to the minister. I must also acknowledge that putting an event of this nature requires the effort of men and women in the background. Your work is highly appreciated, particularly the staff at the Luthuli Museum. We thank you. As Peter has indicated, I've been part of this for I think since inception. In this series of lectures, I cannot recall a musical rendition that surpassed what we received today. I don't remember the name of the group, but they have done well. A round of applause to them, please. Finally, to the program director, the skill that you bring in facilitating this event has been a marvel to watch over the years. It is one tender that should never be reviewed. And finally, to all other participants who joined us in various platforms on social media, we also value your participation. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sandile. And you know, we say this every year, but we really do mean it. And usually when you have an icon such as Chief Albert Luthuli, the families are the ones that sadly have to share this man with millions of people. And so we thank you for the sacrifice that your family has made so that the greater good can come to be. So we thank you so much indeed, and thank you for this opportunity for us to be able to remember and reflect. this icon that was Chief Albert Luthuli. Thank you very much indeed to the Luthuli family. Right, ladies and gentlemen, that's the lecture for 2023. We look forward to your attendance again in the future. And if you're watching at home, thank you so much indeed for tuning in. And please spread the word. These will stay online, and so that a lot of people can watch this and try and unpack it and also get a sense of why this occasion is so important. Whilst our guests make our way to the refreshment area to get a meal, can I ask the Luthuli Council and also our esteemed guests to join us on stage? We're going to take one last mighty group picture. I know. So if our guests and the Luthuli Council can make their way up to the stage, and the rest of you, please go and enjoy some drinks, some food. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us. Thank you, everyone.